Well, it looks like head coach Nick Sirianni is staying on with the Philadelphia Eagles in 2024, and he is cleaning house on his coaching staff. Who's in, who's out for 2024? Locked On Eagles coming up next.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome on in, Eagles fans. I'm Louis DiBiase, co-host of the Locked On Eagles podcast, Eagles expert also over at Bleacher Report. He's Gino Camilleri, scouting director, Eagles content at Bleacher Report, and my co-host on today's edition of Locked On Eagles. We have a flurry of coaching moves to get into that have come after head coach Nick Sirianni met with Jeffrey Lurie on Friday. Plus, we'll discuss what we need to hear from Sirianni and Howie Roseman during their press conference on Wednesday and what we can learn from these other playoff teams in 2024. We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Guys, today's show is sponsored by LinkedIn Jobs. They help you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions do apply. So, Gino, as we know, Nick Sirianni meeting with the media Wednesday. I mean, they didn't need to officially announce he's staying on since he's under contract, and they wouldn't do that anyway because people would then think they were considering firing him, so that's not a good PR look. But we do know with that media availability, he's going to be the head coach in 2024, but it looks like Lurie probably had some demands on Friday, and Sirianni was probably receptive because we know Sean Desai is now out this weekend, although he was already basically fired in the regular season. Matt Patricia not expected to have his contract renewed in Philadelphia, and according to Derek Gunn, Eagles insider, Brian Johnson, the offensive coordinator, not expected to be back next year, even if he does not get a head coaching job. Gino, I'm a huge fan of these results. I preferred Sirianni to not be back this year, but even though he is, I'm glad there's dramatic change on the coaching staff because God knows they needed it.
I got a little flack from saying that I was glad that Sirianni was back.
It is weird that that's like the minority opinion now. Yeah.
And if you look at it, why does he not deserve a second chance? And he did exactly what we asked him to, Lou, where he couldn't fall into the trap of what Doug Peterson did and get stuck in this loyalty brand of being a coach. As a CEO, head coach, you have to make tough decisions. It's a business. And good thing Nick Sirianni did that, because it's tough enough to have to go and replace these guys, but to go and find another head coach at what? It's January 22nd. At this point, you already had Nick Sirianni under contract when you fired Doug and went and looked for a head coach. You'd already be behind the 8 ball. And right now, the continuity aspect is there. It seems that they probably have a good relationship still inside the NovaCare complex with Howie Roseman, Jeffrey Lurie, and Nick Sirianni. And you should trust him to go out there and find these coordinators. And some of the names that are reported that they want to bring in, they are going to interview Ron Rivera. Apparently, Dave Caldwell, they want to interview as well. I'm not so hung up on the names, but the idea of bringing in a veteran coach to be a coordinator next to Nick Sirianni, hopefully lend him a hand through some of the adversity that might hit, where if you look at who his offensive coordinator and his defensive coordinator was, it was a guy who was a co-defensive coordinator at times and was only a defensive coordinator for a year for the Bears, and Sean Desai. Then they bring in Matt Patricia, who he's been all over the board. He was calling offensive plays for a little bit. And on offense, you bring in Brian Johnson, who he's only been an OC calling plays at the college level. I think what Nick Sirianni has to do now is that he has solidified his job. He just has to make his job stable and bring in guys who have done a successful job around the National Football League. Yes, you want to get younger on the offensive side of the ball, but I think defensively, getting one of those veteran type of guys would be a great idea.
No, I agree with that. And you make some good points. Now that Nick Sirianni is back, I like that he's being aggressive in this change with the coaching staff, because as you mentioned, Doug Peterson did not do that, and that's what really lost him his job after the 2020 season. So again, like, I wanted Brian Johnson out, especially, before the season ended, and then after hearing the report about his relationship with Jalen Hurts being strained, and Jalen started to doubt the offensive staff, almost stopped listening to them to a degree, and started improvising, which we know is true because A.J. Brown confirmed that with the interception against Seattle, that him and Hurts were improv pretty much that entire game. So once I heard that, it's like, it's time for an overhaul with this coaching staff, because you do not, once you start having your quarterback not listen to your coaches, we saw that with Carson Wentz, that's when you got to make a change, or bad things are going to happen. So it's good to hear that the Eagles, even if Brian Johnson does not get a head coaching job, that they're going to move on. And then on defense, I agree. Like, they needed a complete change with everything, personnel-wise, with the coaching staff. So I get what you're saying. I think Sirianni, if anybody deserves a second chance, it is him. For me, towards the future, I don't think he's the perfect guy for the long term. But plan B here, like, if this is the scenario that plays out, I'm glad there is a lot of change, and it's not what Doug did after 2019 and 2020. So it's more the results than the idea that I'm a fan of. I don't know, Gino, like, who these options are, though. With Ron Rivera, I like the idea of a veteran defensive coordinator. They also had interest in former Giants defensive coordinator Wink Martindale. I like, again, the premise of these are veteran coaches. They don't have any ties to Jonathan Gannon or Vic Fangio, but the names themselves, I don't know if I really love.
It's still very early in the process. We're still figuring that out.
That too, yeah.
I don't love the idea of Ron Rivera. I don't love the idea of Caldwell. Martindale, I could be open to that idea, but I think right now with Nick Sirianni, it has to get back to a very balanced checks and balances type of system with his coaches. And he needs somebody that isn't just going to be a yes man, somebody that is going to check him. And on offense, they need somebody that is going to bring in vastly new ideas. So this is a great step forward. It's a step forward that you needed, because you aren't just going to be spinning your wheels, which Doug did to an extent, which after he fired Mike Groh, who does he bring in? Press Taylor, another guy who he still has considered bringing back to Jacksonville.
Although, Gino, the one name we've heard is Jim Bob Cooter from the Colts, Shane Steichen's OC. So how different is it going to be, though?
That's very true.
The move.
It's still early. That's the way I'm looking at it. On offense, though, I think it's different from defense. Where defense, I want stability, somebody who's been around the block for a little bit, can bring in ideas to a core, which is probably going to change a lot from what you've seen in 2023. But on offense, bring in somebody who has been around one of the top offenses in football. And heck, even Jim Bob Cooter, we mentioned his name tongue in cheek, and then there was a report that they talked to him. That's somebody who's around. Shane Steichen, who was very good for you. If you talk about the other names that we have mentioned, the guys that are around Sean McVay, the guys that are around Mike McDaniel, the guys that are around these top-level offenses, that's what Nick Sirianni needs. Because if he has shown, and he isn't going to be the guy calling plays, he needs somebody who is going to present a vastly different playbook.
Totally agree.
Because if you are going to hinder yourself and just be in this quote-unquote Nick Sirianni offense, well, you saw what that box was last year when Brian Johnson backed you into a corner and Nick Sirianni backed you into a corner with this JV offense, and all of a sudden you're starting from scratch. But it's a fantastic opportunity to hopefully present a bunch of new ideas for this offense and defense.
And going to the defense again, too, when you look at, again, I don't love, Caldwell, Martindale, even the idea of Ron Rivera, but again, I like what they present, the veteran coach, but also they were all linebacker coaches at one point, Gino, and I think that's a position the Eagles desperately need a coach in there that can develop talent. And I think that's something that's really important. I will say with Ron Rivera, it is interesting because Ron Rivera is a close family friend of Jeffrey Lurie's. He's a guy that coached the Eagles in the early 2000s. Again, a good track record, helped develop guys like Jeremiah Trotter, but that's a Jeffrey Lurie guy. How involved is Lurie and Howie in this process still? It's like, I hope it is Sirianni, because if you don't trust, again, this was my point a lot last week, if you do not trust Sirianni to fully control this process, then you should have fired him. And that was always my take with Doug Peterson, too, when Howie and Lurie threw all these new cooks in the kitchen with Peterson. It's like, if you're going to do that, just fire the guy. So I really hope it is Nick running this entire process.
I do think it's a lot different from that last year of Doug Peterson, where it was just kind of forced on him.
Yeah, right.
To
That's what I
me
hope this is
personally,
not.
my opinion, it seems like they're just doing it to where it isn't one guy being Jeffrey,
I hope so.
one guy being Howie, one guy being Nick,
Yeah.
making the end all be all decision. It does seem to be collaborative, and you have to hope that it is collaborative because the guys that they're bringing in at the coordinator position are going to be the guys that Howie is bringing in the personnel for, which
Right.
has to match what these guys want to do. So that's great to have that cohesion. And same with Nick Sirianni. If it isn't going to be his offense and or defense, he has to be on the same page with these guys philosophically on elements like game management, what their philosophy is in the red zone, situationally on third down. So I think it is a good system to not have one guy make that end all be all decision. But if it comes back to it and we hear 3 years down the road that these were forced on them,
That's what
like
I'm
Doug
saying.
Peterson, well, then yeah, time is a flat circle once again in Philadelphia.
We'll see. They're going to talk to the media Wednesday, though. Howie Roseman and Nick Sirianni will meet with the media Wednesday. They better have some answers for the 2023 collapse. What do Gino and I need to hear from those two on Wednesday? We'll get into that coming up next, right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. At the start of the new year, every small business owner is asking themselves the same question. What's the one move I can make that'll take my business to that next level in 2024? LinkedIn Jobs knows that your success all depends on the team you surround yourself with. Just like Nick Sirianni trying to find his new coordinators, that's why LinkedIn Jobs has created the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. They have a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. They also know that small businesses are wearing so many hats that they might not have the time or resources to hire. Thankfully, with LinkedIn, the process is intuitive, quick, and easy. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions do apply. All right, Eagles fans, thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Want to let you know Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. Howie Roseman, Nick Sirianni, they're going to meet with the media, Gino, on Wednesday, and they're going to have a lot of questions from many different points of view. What happened in 2023 on defense, on offense, the coaching staff. I'm sure they'll be asked about all these stories that came out about, Sirianni's coordinator choices, Jalen Hurts' leadership, offseason decisions that Howie made last year. Like, they're going to get grilled. And with all these different topics that they're going to get pressed on, especially Howie, because he doesn't talk to the media as much as Nick, what's one thing that you need to hear from these guys?
How is it going to be different? How is it going to be different from Doug? How is it going to be different from Chip?
I like
How
that.
is it going to be different from those years that you were down, that you were able to come back? How is it going to be different from a viewpoint of sustainability? Because we have seen Howie Roseman get this thing turned around, but how can he do it for the long term? How is it going to be different, Howie Roseman?
How can you avoid the collapse, right? I think that's the thing for Howie is the sustainability factor. And for me, if I had a couple questions I could ask Roseman, especially, because he does do a really good job of reflecting. I think, as you mentioned, he's done a great job of learning from mistakes. I'm curious what his thoughts are about specifically his decisions on defense that he made last offseason and what his mindset is this year to fix it. Like, I would press him about the linebacker position, the decisions he made to let both TJ Edwards and Kazir White go, his belief in Nakobe Dean, and then his thoughts on the draft. Like, why don't you take linebackers early? Or why have you not taken corners early throughout the years at safety? Just because I want to hear if his answers are different compared to years past, where he very much has been adamant about, you start with the trenches. This is what has worked for us for over 20 years. This is what we're going to do now. I wonder if he's going to be as aggressive with that answer if he's asked these questions, because that's something that I think needs to change next year to a degree, as we've talked about.
I think that's one of the questions inside of my main question of how is it going to be different. And
sure.
I think that's a key point. Like, how are you going to change philosophically
Right.
where you have changed in the past after you came out of the corner when Chip Kelly left the building and you were able to turn it around after the tenure of Doug Peterson? How is it going to be different? Are you going to adjust your philosophical understanding and importance of what it is in the middle of the field when it comes to linebacker?
Right.
I think that plays into what you are saying exactly, Lou. Like, if that report is true that they didn't even offer TJ Edwards a contract
or Kazir White, it sounds like.
Didn't even put a number in front of him.
Yeah.
I don't know how true it is, but I saw this on Twitter. I'm sure a bunch of people did as well.
Clay Harbor was the one that reported it.
Yes, former Philadelphia Eagles tight end. Take it with
and he covers the Bears, so where Edwards is. So
if that's the case, I think he needs to be pressed on that. And the thing about Howie Roseman is, I think a lot of the reporters that have been around, they do poke and prod a little bit because they've seen the story and they see how far they can push Howie Roseman. As long as you don't talk about numbers in particular,
right,
he'll answer the question. But if you're like, hey, Howie, did you offer TJ Edwards a deal?
Yeah, you got to form it right.
No.
Yeah,
we got some questions. Like, why did you think like that at linebacker? And why did you let Chauncey go if he was only at $6 million where Detroit got him?
That's what I want to know. And it's interesting because Howie has, like, he's not somebody that's tight-lipped. I mean, he's come out of, drafts during press conferences, out of seasons, and, he's talked about how their belief for a while was in college production. And then you could really tell after the 2019 season, their end-of-the-year press conference, it was all about health and speed. Like, his mind, you could see he was hell-bent on getting that team younger, healthier, and faster. And then the moves of that offseason backed that up. I mean, how many receivers in the draft did they go after that had a sub 4.3 kind of 40-yard dash? That was something we knew was coming based on his comments. So, we know that Howie's core will always be the trenches, especially in this draft process and quarterback, receiver, like those. That's the MO for this team, and I think it's the right approach. But I do wonder if he'll, just like when he answers questions about linebacker, corner, safety, if the tone will be different. I think that'll be key. But, for Nick Sirianni, who's been the guy that's under fire more over the last few months, now we know he's keeping his job. He's the one deep into this coordinator process right now. Like, if you had a question for Nick, what would it be?
I would ask him to get to the root cause of if he would take accountability for it.
Yeah.
When did you know it was broken and why? Because if he tries to pass the blame around, point fingers, and be like, "Oh, I knew when X, Y, and Z wasn't preparing properly," like Sean,
or there's like a moment that he says, right, like if it's the Niners game, or he pinpoints a time.
And then he puts himself on blast, and you have to follow that up, like you said with the Niners one. Like, get to that point to see if he's going to own up to it and be like, no, it was my process at the top, and I think I set a bad example. Because if that's what it is, I can see why they kept him around, and he truly is the guy that you want inside that building. And like A.J. Brown said, when he made up that comment about trying to get that pass interference penalty to just take the blame for A.J. and Jalen Hurts doing that improvisation, that's something that guys want to play for and a coach that guys want to play for. But at the same time, do coordinators want to work with this guy? So that's the thing. Do you put the blame on those individuals, or heck, even the players? Does he try and blame it on the players? I don't think he does, but I think you got to ask some prodding questions of when did it go wrong, why, and who do you think was the source of the problem?
And I think that goes right into my question. It would be specifically about the dynamic between head coach, play caller, and quarterback. A lot of times, Gino, that's a two-man dynamic, but with the Eagles, we know it's a three-man dynamic. And we read the stories the last few weeks about Sirianni and Brian Johnson, and sometimes players not knowing who was calling plays. And we heard Jalen Hurts was losing belief in the system and did not love how adamant they were about the deep ball. And so that's such a crucial part of this, not rebuild, but this bounce back in 2024 is the relationship between your quarterback, your play caller, and your head coach. And I want to know if he feels like they weren't on the same page. And, like you were mentioning, how things can be different next year, especially with that trio, because you have to, especially if there's inconsistency with who your coordinators are, there has to at least be a consistency in what the dynamic is with those three staples. And it didn't feel like last year the relationship between Sirianni and Brian Johnson was the same as Sirianni and Shane Steichen. I don't know if that's because of a trust thing. I'm not sure what it was, but it definitely was different, and Jalen Hurts knew that, and it caused a strain on his relationships with those guys too.
And I think that plays into the element of, does he take accountability for that? Or does he try and put the blame on, no, I didn't trust the coordinator, so I tried to do more?
Right.
Or is it, I was micromanaging too much and maybe I should have delegated more?
Exactly.
And I think how he frames a lot of these questions is going to be very telling of where he stands. Because if he's very buttoned up and he kind of almost feels like a puppet to an extent, I think we can know where this is going. But if it does seem like he takes a lot of the blame and he was upfront about a lot of the mistakes, well, hopefully that's what he said to Jeffrey Lurie, and that's what made Lurie buy in. And the plan he put forward, it seems to have worked, because he got farther than Doug Peterson at this point, Lou, right? Because we knew in a tumultuous offseason after a rocky season, it doesn't always go well, especially if a coach goes to a Super Bowl. And Nick didn't win his, so they could have made the excuse and got out much quicker from him. So hats off to him. We'll see what happens. The benefit of the doubt, it's still out the window, but he could do a lot if these hires go in that direction. But these reporters in Philadelphia, we know how they do. They will ask the questions that we want to hear in just a couple days.
For sure. The Eagles, I'm sure they're watching these playoff games, Gino, and they're asking a lot of long-term questions. I wonder what they feel like they can learn from these other teams that are still playing deep into January. We'll get into that coming up next right here on Locked On Eagles. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL regular season, it's over. Playoff time is here, and there's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 back in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 back in bonus bets, win or lose. The app is so easy to use. There's so many different ways to bet, like same game parlays that are live. Find bets in the new Explore tab. You can make a parlay in the Parlay Hub, the best way to find popular parlays. We know with the Super Bowl coming up soon, it is popular to bet at FanDuel. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a layup. FanDuel, the official partner of the NFL and the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks, everybody, for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. We're wrapping up a Monday edition of the show, and the NFL just wrapped up the divisional round of the playoffs. We know the Final Four now. It's Baltimore and Kansas City. It's San Francisco and Detroit in the NFC. Gino, is there anything you feel like because I'm sure the Eagles are watching these games and they're asking a lot of questions about how they can get back to where they were in 2022, how they can get back to the Final Four and eventually get back to the Super Bowl. And I think there's always lessons to take from teams every single year, what they did, because the blueprint is always different between what the Chiefs did, what the Eagles did, what Detroit did, Baltimore. Like it's, some things are the same, but a lot of things are different. Is there anything that you specifically has watched from these games and have said the Eagles need to learn this from this team and maybe apply that in 2024?
It is a copycat league.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think it would play into something that the Eagles are built to do. And if you look at 3 out of these 4 teams, you can make the argument that they are run first to an extent, with all of them outside of Kansas City being a run-heavy team. How do the Eagles get back to the creativity on offense to get their run game going to where they were in 2022? Because down the stretch, Lou, what couldn't this Philadelphia Eagles team do in the back half of 2023? They couldn't control the time of possession. They couldn't run the football. They weren't breaking off these chunky yardages for 5.5, 6 yards a pop. They weren't having these 250-yard performances on the ground. But look at San Francisco. Look at the Lions. Heck, Buffalo pushed Kansas City to the brink with how good their run game was. But why does the run game open up? Because of the pass. It's almost a backwards league now where the pass helps open up the run, but you got to have creativity. How can the Eagles take away some of that creativity and use it as their own? Heck, do they try and poach somebody away from one of these teams? I think that's something that you got to be intrigued with, that maybe a quarterback coach or a run game or a pass game coordinator from one of these 4 teams, that might be the way forward. Because you look at these 4 teams and the teams that they played in the divisional round, heck, even Houston right now looked like they had a much more creative offense. How do the Eagles get back to that? Because They were competing at a JV level against NFL teams.
You know what's funny, too, is you mentioned the run game, and we made an analogy, I think it was a few years ago, or maybe in 2022. It's like you don't want to have – we compare the run game to the Hulk in the Avengers. It's like you don't want to always have to have the Hulk be what carries you, right? That's not sustainable. But there are times when everything else is going wrong, you just need to dial up the big angry green guy. And I think that's what the Eagles' run game was. It's 2021, 2022, like, damn, the passing game's not working. We don't have it today. Let's just go to the offensive line. Let's go to Miles Sanders. And this year, they really did not have that. And I think that's, especially when you get deep into January, the weather gets different. Again, you play so up and down. Things are inconsistent in the NFL. You need to have a consistent run game. And, you mentioned Buffalo, how it's done things for Detroit, San Fran. I mean, that's Baltimore's MO too. And even Kansas City, like Isaiah Pacheco has been great for that team. And in one of their most inconsistent years they've had in the Mahomes, Reed, Kelsey era. So I agree with that. And I think you were talking about creativity with offenses. And it goes back to what we were talking about in segment 2 and what we've been talking about all week, the last few weeks, is you got to have the in sync between your play caller and your quarterback. I mean, it's just so important. I mean, look how in sync Matt LaFleur was with Jordan Love in Green Bay, or, Slowick and Stroud in Houston. Obviously, Reed and Mahomes in Kansas City. Baltimore with Monken and Lamar. But even, it's been able to overcompensate for teams that don't have star quarterbacks. So, Jared Goff is very good, but he's not a star. Ben Johnson has made him look like a star, and he's going to get a head coaching job because of it. Obviously, Kyle Shanahan with Brock Purdy. It's obvious, but it's so clear the impact that a play caller can have in the NFL. It can do wonders for your team if you have an elite one.
So in a way, you're saying you want your quarterback to be a system quarterback that fits within the system of your offensive.
I want a star quarterback, but I think you need an elite play caller too. Having a star quarterback is
every quarterback is a system quarterback to a degree, because if it doesn't work within the system, they're not going to be Superman like you saw with Jalen Hurts.
I want there to be an elite system. I want to have an elite quarterback that can play outside it if he needs to. But I think if you don't have an elite system at all, you can't have a quarterback that's playing outside of structure every single snap. That's how you get to 9-8, sure, in a wild card, but a championship team needs a championship play caller.
That's how you lose 6 out of your last 7 football games and only scored
even
9
when you have
points
star offensive power. Yeah.
And I'm with you, man, whether it's bringing in a fullback. 2 out of these 4 teams primarily have a fullback, or
it's true.
Whether it's using more of that middle of the field area in the yards after the catch example, like San Francisco does all the time, or just leaning on the run game with a multi-back system that opens up the downfield threat of guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown and a rhythm and timing offense like Detroit. You just have to have that synchronicity, like you said. And I think at the end of the day, too, Lou, you can never have enough depth. I think you have to just hats off to Howie Roseman in 2017 for what he did, because you look at teams like Buffalo, they're down to guys like A.J. Klein at the linebacker position, and whatever's going on in Kansas City with their wide receivers right now, they're down to guys that, Mecole Hardman can't do anything right at this point. You just have to have so many good football players this time of year. And look at Baltimore. I think they're built to last. I think San Francisco's built to last. All of these teams are. You have to have so much depth and youth. Youth is the way forward in this league, man. Look how many good young football players were making plays this weekend. You mentioned Jordan Love looks like he's going to be a threat in the NFC moving forward, and the young crop of wide receivers they have, and just all over this league, man. You got to get younger. You got to get faster, and just got to have creativity, because if you don't, you're going to be the Eagles 2023.
I agree. We'll see what happens. I'm so curious for Wednesday's press conference between Howie Roseman and Nick Sirianni, but we do have another show before that tomorrow. We have a show for you Monday through Friday, still right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Even during the offseason, we thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. That'll do it for today's show. For Gino Camilleri, I'm Lou DiBiase signing off. As always, thank you for downloading, thank you for watching and listening, and let's go Birds.
Fly, Eagles, fly.